Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and honestly pretty provocative perspective on the global stage. We're looking at some recent commentary that suggests we might literally be watching a tectonic shift in the long-standing alliance between the United States and Europe. We're going to use the exact data points and arguments from our source material to map out why some top strategists think this transatlantic dynamic is starting to fracture. So if you like getting into the why behind the major headlines, you're definitely in the right place.
Okay, let's run through our agenda for this explainer real quick. We've got 5 parts. First, the transatlantic alliance question. Second, analyzing Europe's internal challenges. Third, population versus military power. Fourth, a history of unreciprocated support. And lastly, the predicted U.S. pivot. We're going to neutrally deconstruct these exact arguments step by step. All right, moving right into part 1, the transatlantic alliance question. Let's lay out the core thesis here.
So here is the big, foundational question the source material is trying to answer. Does Europe need the U.S. more than the U.S. needs Europe? Now, for decades, right, the assumption has been that this is a totally mutual reliance, a two-way street. But the commentary we're analyzing today argues something a bit different. It suggests that recent political turbulence didn't necessarily cause a new rift, but instead kind of tore off a scab. And it exposed a pre-existing truth that America's allies across the Atlantic might actually need Washington's military umbrella far, far more than Washington needs them.
To really capture this growing American frustration, the source points to a quote from Vance. He brings up a very specific grievance, basically saying, look, I have heard chirping from the European media about everything that's wrong with the United States, but part of the reason why we spend so much on defense is because we have tens of thousands of troops stationed in Europe. And the commentary uses this to make the case that it's entirely reasonable to expect Europe to start taking ownership of its own backyard, rather than leaning so heavily on American taxpayers.
Which brings us to part 2, analyzing Europe's internal challenges. Because the source argues, this reliance is actually getting worse due to some major internal vulnerabilities. The commentary points to 4 specific things it calls existential problems that are weakening Europe from the inside out. We're looking at shrinking populations, major energy insecurity, immense pressures from open borders and migration, and finally, a long-term pursuit of pacifist policies. The core argument here is that by pursuing certain ideological goals, sweeping Green New Deals, completely open borders, Europe has actively undermined its own independent strength.
And to really drive that vulnerability home, the commentary cites one incredibly stark statistic, a fertility rate of 1.3. Now that is way, way below the replacement level. The source leans heavily on this demographic argument to show that Europe's population base is rapidly shrinking. So think about it. When you combine a shrinking population with years of pacifistic policies, the commentary suggests Europe has essentially left itself disarmed and demographically weak, which forces them to rely even more on the U.S. for basic security.
A huge example the source uses for this insecurity is Germany's energy policy. They actually use the phrase energy suicide. The claim is that Germany actively dismantled its own fossil fuel and nuclear power plants and chose to rely heavily on Russian natural gas instead. And the really fascinating, or maybe frustrating depending on how you look at it, part of this argument is the claim that American leaders explicitly warned Europe about this exact dependency years before any conflicts broke out, but those warnings were basically just laughed off.
All right, part 3, population versus military power. This is really the climax of the source's argument.
If you've ever just assumed that the U.S. has a vastly larger population than Europe, the commentary definitely wants to correct that misconception. The U.S. has roughly 340 million people, but when you combine the EU and non-EU NATO members, you're looking at 450 million people. The source highlights this to show that Europe actually has a significantly larger demographic base. We're talking about a massive, highly educated population sitting right there.
And economically, the gap is also a lot smaller than you might think. Those same European nations hold roughly 60% of the United States GDP. That is immense economic wealth. But the commentary argues that despite all of this massive economic and demographic potential, Europe's actual military power doesn't match up at all. And the source stresses a very specific phrase here, which is their choice. The argument is that Europe deliberately chose not to build up its military, prioritizing domestic spending instead, because they knew they could count on America to handle the defense side of things.
And that leads to this incredibly striking historical metaphor from the commentary. The source describes modern European nations as acting like Greek philosophers, meaning they sit above the fray, maintaining this highly educated, enlightened, pacifistic stance. But the second a real geopolitical crisis hits, those philosophers are forced to call in the crude Roman legionnaires, which in this case is the U.S. military, to step in and handle the harsh, ugly, physical realities of global security. It's just a wildly vivid way to describe this perceived cultural and military dependency.
Moving right into Part 4, a history of unreciprocated support. The commentary argues that this dependency wouldn't actually be such a big deal if it were a two-way street.
But historically, they argue it hasn't been. The source lays out a clear pattern of military interventions: the British in the Falklands in 1982, the French in Chad in the 80s, the coalition in Serbia in the 90s, the intervention in Libya in 2011. The source is very explicit here. None of these conflicts were truly vital to United States national interests. These were European expeditionary missions. But in every single instance, the U.S. stepped in behind the scenes. They provided the essential logistical support, the fuel, the critical reconnaissance that ensured the Europeans actually succeeded.
And right here is where the source pinpoints the root of some profound American anger. While the U.S. consistently provided this quiet, behind-the-scenes support, the commentary argues the European allies completely failed to reciprocate. When the U.S. faced its own crises, specifically with nations known for global disruption or terrorism, like Iran, did European nations offer quiet help or the use of their bases? The source claims no. Instead, they demagogue the issues to play to their own domestic audiences, basically leaving the U.S. hanging out to dry.
So, Part 5, the predicted U.S. pivot. What does the source think is actually going to happen because of all this accumulating tension?
Well, they're forecasting a massive, fundamental shift in U.S. foreign policy. The prediction is a deliberate pivot away from traditional Western European allies, specifically calling out British and French unilateralists. Instead, the source anticipates the U.S. is going to heavily tilt its focus and resources toward Asian partners and Eastern European NATO members. Why? Because those nations are perceived as taking their defense commitments much, much more seriously.
So what does that pivot actually look like in practice? Basically, it means the end of the status quo. The commentary predicts that the very next time a Western European nation launches a unilateral expeditionary mission, the U.S. is simply going to refuse to get involved. No quiet logistical support, no emergency fuel, no advanced reconnaissance. That whole era of the Roman legionnaires rushing in to save the Greek philosophers, according to this analysis, that era is coming to a hard close. Which leaves us with one massive overarching question. What does a potential U.S. pivot actually mean for the future of global security? We've walked through the source's data together: the demographic shifts, the economic choices, the historical grievances, and the predicted fallout. Look, whether you agree with this analysis or not, it represents a highly influential school of thought right now. And if this perspective ends up shaping future foreign policy, Europe will be forced to rapidly rebuild its militaries, and the entire global balance of power is going to fundamentally change. I really want you to chew on that as you process today's explainer. Thank you so much for hanging out with me to unpack these complex ideas today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I will see you in the next explainer.